demonstration, we're going to be looking at some beef cuts. I got these beef cuts from my local grocer, IGA, plain and simple. I chose the T-bone steak. It's got that distinctive T-shaped bone down the middle. And I chose shin beef with the bone in. We're going to look at some of the features of the T-bone steak. It's found along the back of the cow between the sirloin and right before the ribs. The T-bone is actually a part of the spine, as you can see here, and it has some, on either side are the back muscles. Now, the primal group of this cut is called the short loin, and the muscles here are more supportive and are a part of the postural muscles. These muscles are made up of skeletal muscle, a little bit of connective tissue, and a lot of intramuscular fat, meaning the meat is going to be more tender and easier to get that desired marbling. These features, it's all about quality with this one, followed by that yield. And by quality, what we're going to be looking for is good quality marbling, good fat color, good meat color, nice texture, and no signs of ossification or any defects like that. So here's a good example of the shin beef with the bone in that we acquired. Now you'll usually find these either in the front or the back of the legs of the cow. When the bone is left in, it's often called osso bucco in your local stores. Now, shin beef is part of the shin primal group and is part of the locomotive group of muscles which spends its days holding the animal up and moving quite a lot. Therefore, the muscles generally have a lot less fat and a lot more connective tissue, meaning the meat is generally tougher. The shin primal will often have bundles of muscle surrounded by collagen, as seen here, with much stronger elastin covering the whole thing along the edges there, and that's often termed the silver skin, and that's very much stronger than connective tissue. And this primal of shin is all about yield and getting that maximal yield, that high muscularity, good trimness, not a lot of fat cover, and with a cut such as this, it's actually advantageous to have a lot of connective tissue. So the reason I chose these two cuts was I didn't really grow up on a lot of meat. So it's really hard to tell the difference between different cuts and cooking methods. And I thought it would be a really great opportunity to find out a really clear contrast between a very high value cut such as the T-bone compared to a very low value cut, which is the shank. And generally it's labeled that the T-bone is far more tender and your shank's just going to be very tough. But I thought it would be really interesting to see how cooking methods could either be better or for worse, these different cuts, and really the chemistry of the meat, and see how you cook the meat can actually make certain low value cuts quite delicious. Scores here, some fat color and some meat color. Now the meat has been seasoned, so it's a bit harder to see these certain features. We've got some, you can see some flecks of marbling through here and here, and if you look carefully enough you can see them in there. And comparing them to MLA, we were able to assess that they're around an MSA score of 600 to maybe 700, but really 600, maybe 500, like around 600 really. Comparing it to the fat color was fairly good. It was around 3 or 4, which is acceptable. The texture was uniform pretty well. There was signs of a bit of purging around here and a bit of loose cut up meat, but it's turned up pretty fine and solid. The meat color overall was good with ratings of 3 to 2. Hasn't got that dark color look yet, and because they're still fresh out of those vacuum seals, they look a bit more purpley, and they're still being oxidized, and they'll turn that cherry red color soon. Overall, the T-bone steak was fairly high quality and was ticking off some of those key factors that might make it a good steak. Now, comparing just the shin beef, it's going to be a bit more different. The shin beef is going to produce a lot more different results, and it actually kind of has a different aim to it. If you were just to compare marbling to the shin beef, you'd see that this is a very different cut of meat. Now, as we can see, these white flecks aren't actually marbling, they're connective tissue, and you've got that silver skin on the outside of each one. And these muscles are grouped into these little packages almost. And so it gets marbling scores as low as 300, 200. Its fat color was fairly good though. Where present, it's a pretty lean cut. There's not a lot of fat. The meat texture was fairly good at around 2 and 3. Maybe a little bit dark in some areas, getting into the around here, but really it's still a very good cut, maybe going up to a 4 toward that dark cutter. But it's a very flavorful meat. Now the main features we're going to be looking for is that it has that high yield in the slab, and which we can see some of the slabs do get a bit bigger, and that's what we really want. We want to get as much muscularity, really trim meat, and a lot of connective tissue, because that's going to really make it flavoursome when we really slow cook this meat, and it's just spaced throughout. Furthermore, it's good that there's no signs of ossification between in the bones here, which means it was still a fairly young animal, and so it's going to be a bit tastier and a bit tender. T-bone steak, it's great marbling, good meat colour, along with those other desirable smooth texture, and it's overall a very high quality cut. The shin beef, on the other hand, was a bit more different. It didn't have nearly as much fat, nearly any fat at all. Muscles were grouped into clumps, and it had a lot more connective tissue because of that locomotive nature of its muscles. But for what the shin beef is providing, it is doing a very good job at that. 2 different cooking methods I chose would be frying and casseroling. The reason I wanted to do this was that they were really good examples of a dry cook and then a slow wet cook. With the frying, it's really high temperature for a short amount of time, and it can retain a lot of that moisture, whereas that slow wet cook, it really brings out the flavors of certain cuts. The ingredients we used were all the same, so they were all cooked with olive oil and butter, and I threw in some mushrooms, potatoes, onions, garlic, rosemary, and the only difference was that the casserole had a bit of beef broth in it. So when frying the meat, we used a dry heat cooking method. This is basically just to retain that juiciness inside the meat and that water and avoid that water loss. So we wanted to fry it to medium rare. The quick frying forms a nice crust on the outside, and along with that it develops this boiling zone to around 100 degrees in the middle. Cuts that have low connective tissue and collagen, but a high amount of marbling, definitely benefit from this type of cooking method, as the meat inside will melt and diffuse the marbling throughout the meat, increasing the flavor and getting that cascade of flavors. Aiming for a medium rare degree of doneness provides that juicy texture, and thanks to the myoglobin in the blood, will show up as a nice pink color. We really want to avoid losing any water in frying to keep the water holding capacity nice and high for that final evaluation. And we simply repeated the same procedure with the shin beef cuts. So the casserole involved frying the meat to get a brown crusted exterior, 5 minutes on each side. Casseroling is essentially more of a slow wet cook, so we'll be keeping the meat at a medium temperature to soften up those connective tissues. Connective tissue is full of collagen, but by getting it beyond 68 degrees allows the collagen to denature and forms gelatin. This makes the meat really tender and flavorful. Sitting around 150 degrees in the oven for 5 hours means the meat will generate flavors, stimulating protein and sugars to start reacting, and further stimulate molecular changes, which is all known as the Maillard reaction. Slow wet cooks often turn tough meat very tender and brings out that natural flavor. And we just simply repeat the same process, but just use T-bone steak cuts instead. What we did to the meat beforehand, they were vacuum sealed, and I took them out and I sprinkled them with salt and pepper and left them for about an hour and a half. All the T-bone steak was fairly tender and juicy. We got that medium rare quality in the middle. It scored 70 on smell, 80 on flavor, 90 on tenderness, 80 on juiciness, 75 on overall liking. Looked at the shin beef, when it was fried, it went very rubbery and stringy. Still some of the flavor, but it was generally quite overpowering. 60 on smell, 65 on flavor, 50 on tenderness, 35 on juiciness, and overall liking was around 45. With the casseroling, there was a big difference. The shin beef was probably the best. It was falling right off the bone, very flavorful, very soft. So it got a 90 for smell, 95 for flavor, 90 for tenderness, 80 for juiciness, and overall liking was 100. And the T-bone steak, when casseroled, was incredibly dry and rubbery and incredibly difficult to eat. So for smell, this got 90. For flavor, it got 40. For tenderness, it got 80. But for juiciness, it got 10. And overall liking, probably at a 10.